What's up guys, my name is Rudy Meadows and today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle and why it is important for your photos. Let's get started. So your exposure triangle breaks down into three separate parts: your shutter speed, your f-stop, and your ISO. Each one of those plays an important role when it comes to you getting the kind of photo you want with the correct exposure. Your shutter speed determines how long your shutter stays open. If you want motion blur and long light streaks or something like that, then you're going to have to leave your shutter open for a long period of time. If you're trying to freeze the action in the frame with like sports photography and really capture that person in the middle of whatever they're doing, then you have to use a really fast shutter speed. Your f-stop determines your depth of field. A small f-stop number is a large opening, so it's kind of counterintuitive, and a large f-stop number is a small opening. The smaller the number, the smaller the depth of field. The larger the number, the greater the depth of field. And your ISO determines how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. The smaller the number, the less sensitive it is and the less noise you'll have in your image. The larger the number, the more sensitive it is to light, but the more noise you'll get as you step it up. So we're here in Lightroom and I have some images pulled up to show you guys some different examples of what the different settings of your exposure triangle would do in different situations. We'll start with these two images. I'm sure right off the bat you've noticed that one of them is very blurry. The biggest thing when it comes to shutter speed is that you have to set your shutter speed according to what you're shooting. If you're shooting a moving subject, you're going to shoot with a faster shutter speed. And if you're shooting a slower subject or something that's not moving, then you can shoot something that's much slower, even into the several of seconds for an exposure time. With this image, I wanted to show you guys what it would look like if you shot a moving subject and give you guys an example or a comparison to basically the same image but at a much faster shutter speed. The one on the left is a 1/40th of a second shutter speed, while the one on the right is a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed. As you can see when you zoom in, there's no motion blur on the image on the right, but on the image of the left, there's a ton of motion blur and it makes the image almost useless. Unless you're trying to shoot the motion blur, in which case, by all means, go for it. I was not. Well, I guess I was. But normally I wouldn't. So make sure you guys set your shutter speed according to what you're trying to shoot. If you're trying to shoot light streaks or star trails or anything like that, you're gonna have to use a long shutter speed. If you're trying to freeze the action, of course, you're gonna have to use a much faster shutter speed. Otherwise, the subject is going to move and create a motion blur on themselves. So let's go ahead and jump into the next two images. With these two images, I adjusted the f-stop of the image, which is gonna change the aperture size and the depth of field. Right away, I'm sure they look very similar and the pose is very similar, but if you look at the background, I'm sure you've noticed that the background is out of focus in one, but very clearly in focus in the other. And this is because of the depth of field. The image on the right, I shot with an f-stop of f22, while the image on the left, I shot with an f-stop of f2.8. The wider aperture, the smaller f-stop, is gonna give you a much more shallow depth of field, but it's gonna make your subject really pop if you hit the focus right. If you have a much deeper depth of field, it's going to be a little bit more forgiving when you're trying to focus, but it's going to make your image look kind of flat. So in shooting portrait photography, I always tend to try and shoot with a wide open aperture or a smaller f-stop number, so your subject really pops off of your image. For these last two images, the only thing I changed was the ISO. I balanced everything else to get the exposure right because for one of them, the ISO is as high as I could get it for my camera, and it really blows the image out when you're shooting in the middle of the day. For these two images, I don't know if you can tell right away, but I can. The image on the right is very grainy and noisy. If I zoom in, you for sure can tell. The higher you crank up your ISO, the more noise it's going to introduce into your image. I try not to shoot above 1600 if I can help it, because it starts to introduce more and more noise after that. You have some at 800, you have some at 1600, you have some at 400, but you really don't start seeing it. It doesn't start to become a problem until after 1600 during the day. So that's where I try and shoot. I try and shoot below 1600 if I can. There's really not much to talk about with these two images besides how noisy they get. I tried to keep the pose the same or as similar as I could and the location as similar as I could, just so you guys can see without any other distractions. So yeah, that one's a pretty easy one to look at. Alright guys, that's it for me today. If you guys like this video, please hit that like button down below and subscribe if you're not already. And I will see you guys next time.